All right, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to class as usual. And thanks for everybody on Zoom. Today, it's really my pleasure to invite Dr. Nadine Ibrahim for a talk in our Intro to Sustainability class. I'll give you a brief introduction of Dr. Ibrahim. Dr. Ibrahim is the Turkstra Chair in Urban Engineering and a lecturer in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Waterloo in Canada. She holds a bachelor's, a master's, and a PhD in civil engineering, so like everybody here, and a certificate of preventive engineering and social development from the University of Toronto. Transcending the boundaries of civil engineering, she combines environmental engineering and incorporates non-engineering fields, including economics and governance. She combines her academic experience with industry practice in the areas of urban infrastructure, sustainable cities, and sustainable development, focusing on climate change mitigation in global cities, mega cities, as well as mega regions. She leverages her industry experience in urban sustainability projects in Canada and abroad. In Canada, she worked with municipalities in Southern Ontario on assessment management, risk assessment, infrastructure planning, and capital budgeting. Abroad in the Middle East and North Africa, she worked in international development on large-scale projects for clients, including the World Bank and the Global Environment Facility. She was also a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto, working on engineering education for sustainable cities in Africa, launching a sustainable cities course online, and piloting a global classroom. Dr. Ibrahim is active in the scholarship of teaching and learning in engineering leadership and chairs the special interest group on the Engineer of 2050 at the Canadian Engineering Education Association, and is on the Pan-Canadian Advisory Committee for the Canadian Engineering Grand Challenges. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ibrahim for her talk. Nadine, please go ahead. The virtual floor is all yours.
Okay, wonderful. Good morning. I know we are in the same time zone because I checked, so that's wonderful. And I want to say it gives me great pleasure to see a classroom and to see people in a classroom. We're still not there yet at the University of Waterloo. And I want to thank Marwa for this beautiful invitation. I think one of the benefits of this COVID world we live in is that I can join you from the comfort of my basement, but short of that, I hope to one day actually visit your university. So let me get started. My goal is to try to wrap this up sort of around 1 and leave some room for discussion and questions. And the title that I've prepared for today is Advancing Sustainability in Cities Using Urban Metabolism. And the area of research that I'm primarily involved in relates to cities, global cities in general. And Marwa and I crossed paths, dare I say 10 years ago, when we were both working out of Cairo and in sort of when I was wearing that industry hat, working on international development. So I'll try to touch upon that as well as I go. So I just thought it would be nice to start off with, since we're talking about sustainability, this memorial that was placed in Iceland, and it was a message to the future commemorating this lost glacier. So I'll read it out. It's a letter to the future, which says, Oak is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. And in the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it. And it is signed August 2019, 415 parts per million CO2. And I think it's just so striking because we know today what needs to happen, but it's a message for the future so that we can try to reverse some of the actions that are still reversible today. So the glacier actually became referred to as Oak, though it started off being, the name of the glacier is Oakjökull, but it lost that glacier status. So it's now just Oak. And it's just a message, and I'll try to bring that full circle at the end, because I also chair a committee called the Engineer of 2050. So looking to the skills and attributes of what students should have and should know what to do in the future, given lots of unpredictable scenarios that we might be faced with. So since the talk is about cities, and I'm going to talk a little bit about urban metabolism, I thought it would be nice to start off with defining what is considered urban. So I asked Google, what does Google think of urban? And this is the first image search of the word urban based on a Google search. So you'll see here lots of high rises, very dense, some highways. Some have little green, other images don't have green at all. And that's generally the characteristics of urban environments, demonstrating rapid population growth, density, which claims to be the solution to the overpopulation growth in many cities around the world. So urban in the developed world actually looks very different than urban in the developing world. So I'll start off with my experience and exposure to urban in the developed world. I worked in asset management for municipalities in Southern Ontario, and asset management is really the management of infrastructure that is owned and operated by municipalities, primarily the water sector or the transportation sector, where municipalities are really faced with a decision to repair or replace, and generally characterized with the global north or the west, where the challenge here lies predominantly in aging infrastructure and trying to build that capacity to accommodate the growth. Urban in the developing world looks slightly different in that my exposure to it has been through the lens of projects.
You're doing the school thing?
Oh, sorry. Was that a question for me? I'm just not keeping track of the chat, but I see.
Someone's mic is hot. They need to mute it.
Mute yourself. Make sure to mute yourself, please. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Sorry, I didn't know what that was. I was based out of Cairo and working on international development projects in this part of the world, Middle East and the North Africa region, which is a very fertile land in receiving financial assistance on projects related to water resources or rural electrification or urban electrification, provision of basic services like water or transportation. And my very first project based out of Cairo is the informal sector as it relates to the privatization of waste management. And this is sort of my eyes into the international development side of sustainability. And this is organized chaos in their ability to organize and source, separate, and recycle a lot of the waste that's collected in the city. So if we can understand urban and we can understand how cities function, it'll give us a good idea of how to make it better. And there's been many analogies when it relates to cities. We could see cities as gears in a machine, all working together to achieve a certain goal. Or other analogies relate to cities being like ants in a colony, all working together, individual activities or collective activities to achieve a goal. Other analogies relate to highway systems, how you've got the main highways, you've got collectors and arterial roads, and cities are connected in a similar fashion this way. We could also see it as cities being like rivers in a network. You've got the rivers, you've got the tributaries, and you've got the whole watershed and an upstream and a downstream. That's somehow seen as the hierarchy of some of the cities, some larger cities and towns and neighborhoods. My favorite analogy is cities are like biodiversity in an ecosystem. They're all different, but they all depend on one another. And this is particularly the case in the globalization that we see, that a lot of the global cities look pretty much the same, are faced with similar challenges, but it's the local context sometimes that matters more. So I want to share some statistics around urban in general, but cities, and I'll read it out, and I just want you to reflect a little bit at the magnitude of some of these numbers that relate to the statistics coming from cities. So half of humanity, that's about 3.5 billion people, live in cities today. By 2030, almost 60% of the world's population will live in urban areas. 95% of urban expansion in the next decades will take place in the developing world. 828 million people live in slums today, and the number keeps rising. And the world's cities occupy just 3% of the Earth's land, but they account for 60 to 80% of energy consumption and 70% of carbon emissions. So despite occupying such a small area, they're actually responsible for a lot more than their fair share of energy and carbon emissions. And rapid urbanization is exerting pressure on freshwater supplies, on sewage, the living environment, and public health. And so here's the glimmer of hope in that high density of cities actually is what brings some efficiencies into the sustainability of cities, because it provides hope for technological innovation and reducing some of these resource consumption and this energy consumption that takes place in cities. But density is not always brings the positivity it claims to be. So here's a word that was coined fairly recently called the demons of density. And sometimes some of the drawbacks of living in such densely populated urban areas, despite being very prosperous global cities. So the demons of density here is just images to show you what it looks like in Grand Central Station, New York. Here's a traffic jam in Bangkok. Chinese road traffic during peak rush hour in China. Taxis in New York City just idling around. And it brings me to one of the biggest challenges here, which is urbanization in Africa. So urbanization globally is one story, but in Africa, a lot of the urbanization is really magnified. A study that was conducted by some colleagues and myself of African cities found that in 2100, so by the turn of the century, African cities will make up 13 of the top 20 cities worldwide. That's 5 of the top 10 or 13 of the top 20. So on the list here, you'll see the top 20 cities, and you'll see that also mostly they're African cities. By 2100, New York City doesn't show up in the top 20. Tokyo or London, what we commonly know today as the top global cities or the most populated global cities, do not show up in the top 20 by 2100. And African cities are well aware of these findings. They know today that they already have challenges to contend with. It will only be much more magnified if these issues are not addressed in a timely manner. So my insight into Africa really started during my postdoctoral work at the University of Toronto, working on a project called Engineering Education for Sustainable Cities in Africa. And this project took me to a few cities in sub-Saharan Africa predominantly, but Cairo as well. And you'll see here on the map, just on the right, there's the orange dot here at the bottom of Africa to the right is not a typo, it's not a mistake, it's actually the little island of Mauritius. And the project was really very insightful in looking at some of the challenges.
You muted the wrong person.
Oh, sorry, I seemed to have
sorry,
muted.
I'm trying to mute everybody else.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay, am I okay now?
Yeah.
Okay. And so going to explore some of the challenges in sub-Saharan Africa, whether it relates to.
You have to unmute her. Yeah, just unmute her.
Oh. There we go.
All right, are we good now?
Sorry, yeah, sorry.
Okay, no problem.
Making sure that if nobody talks in the rest of the talk.
Okay. Sorry, I was saying how this project took a look at some of the challenges in the African context and tried to bring it back into the curriculum so that the curriculum could be more up to date in a lot of the public and private universities on the African continent, to really bring some context to the challenges so that the graduates coming out of these institutions can really be employable and useful and productive in the economies that would absorb them. So my starting point is really the population growth when it comes to cities, and cities are home to over 50% of the world's population, and that's expected to rise another 70% by 2050. And if we look at the chart here, on the x-axis is a timeline up until 2050, and on the y-axis is population. And what's plotted here is the urban population and the rural population, urban in orange and the rural population in blue. So the rural populations have always been more than the urban populations up until just before 2010, when it was reversed because of the migration of a lot of people into cities for what it promises in terms of economic prosperity. And it's at that point that the curves turned and there's more people living in urban settings. So out of this additional growth, 2 billion of these residents will actually be based in the African continent. And if we look at where cities are located, it's really where there is light, and the agglomeration of cities shows the activity. And with activities in cities comes energy use. So there's a near doubling of the energy demand since the 19th. Another 85% by 2050. And if we compare here a chart that correlates the urban and rural populations with energy use, the rural is in green and the urban is in blue. When we plot the energy use, you can clearly see that it's the urban populations that are the prime sort of candidates and responsible for much of the energy consumption. So it's not the agricultural land, it's not the farmland, it's really what takes place in cities where we live and work and play. With energy use comes greenhouse gas emissions. And so cities account for 70% of these emissions, and that also is expected to increase. So all the numbers are on the rise if we continue to grow at current trends of urbanization and economic growth. But greenhouse gas emissions around the world are not equally distributed. It's an unfair distribution in that some countries produce more than others. You can see here, Canada and the US, top ones over here, producing more carbon emissions per capita than many of the other countries listed here. And at the tail end of the x-axis, you can see some of the low-income countries that produce very little, but are disproportionately impacted by a lot of the climate change impacts. So you can see here a lot of the African cities lie, African countries rather, lie at this end of the axis. But there is some hope because the cost of climate action is large. However, cities are also contributing not just to climate change, but also as drivers to the solutions around climate action, because they are the economic drivers in the countries in which they are located in. So it's estimated at $3 trillion annually, at least for the C40 cities, in terms of the cost of climate action. And so just to give you a sense of economic growth in cities, because they are both contributors to climate change, but also hold the drivers for much of the solution around it, the 50 largest cities have a combined population of 500 million. They've got a large GDP, close to 10,000 billion, and they emit 2.6 billion tons, which makes them, just those 50 cities, they are 1/5 of the world's economic activity. So having, walked you through a little bit of the urban lens of looking at cities, I want to jump into measuring sustainability and what we can measure. If we can measure it, then we can manage it. And so the Sustainable Development Goals, maybe you are familiar with them, maybe not. I'm also, if you could see, wearing my sustainability pin, which I try to remember to wear every day as a reminder to do what we do to try to impact much of these targets. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals set to be achieved within this decade. So this decade between 2020 and 2030 is considered the decade of action. And my area of work and research and teaching applies to the SDG Goal 11, which is Sustainable Cities and Communities. And it has a goal to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So that's my bread and butter.